January 1st, 1863 marks the monumental shift of meaning for the Civil War, although not in the way that many today are under the impression it did. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free all slaves, and in fact was only intended to free slaves in rebel states, though not all of them. Southern secessionist states that were already occupied by the North were exempt from the proclamation, as were all border states. Furthermore, those states who had left the Union for the Confederacy and were not exempt weren't going to just let go of the slaves that they'd been fighting all this time to keep. This meant that Northern military enforcement would be required for the proclamation to mean anything. Nevertheless, the act itself meant something to so many. It also officially allowed black men to join the Union Army and Navy, opening the doors for hundreds of thousands of freedom-craving men to join the war effort. By the end of it all, roughly 200,000 black soldiers had risked their lives to protect their fellow countrymen. At the same time, the North enacted a draft for its citizens. The Confederacy had done the same a year prior, but for the Union, this was a sign of the times. The war wasn't going as smoothly as President Lincoln had hoped. Thus, as conscription went into effect in the North, both sides prepared for battle once more. The Union had two goals at the moment: take down General Lee and Richmond, and capture Vicksburg, thus fully controlling the Mississippi River. The latter objective was highly concerning for the South, which had thus far been struggling to maintain their Tennessee border, as the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers made it hard to keep the Northerners out. Furthermore, General Grant had already seized control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers with the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Union Admiral David Farragut had also taken New Orleans, cutting the Confederates off from the Gulf of Mexico, while the capture of Memphis had nearly wrestled the Mississippi away from the South already. Still, without Vicksburg, this couldn't be done. Grant was now determined to take the city and the river with it. In the summer of 1862, he had made his first attempt alongside General William T. Sherman, but the early attempt ended in a decisive defeat and withdrawal at the Battle of the Chickasaw Bayou, although the Northerners were ready to try again by the following spring. Up until this point, Grant and his men had struggled to even gain access to Vicksburg due to the surrounding swamps, bayous, and otherwise seemingly impregnable terrain. Feeling innovative and quite a bit stubborn, Grant put his men to work to change this. For weeks, they drained bayous, built bridges, and formed roads that could actually be utilized to reach the city. Trekking along their newly constructed path through Louisiana and across the river, Grant and his army marched into battle. Having been called on by the general to assist, Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter led a naval force along the river to back the land troops. Despite being under heavy fire from Confederate defenses, Porter and his men ran the gauntlet like champs, losing only a single ship in the process and providing necessary support to Grant. By April 29, 1863, everyone was in position and ready to launch the attack. Grant's plan was as follows. Sherman would be sent to feign an attack at Snyder's Bluff. Colonel Benjamin Garrison would lead a raid further inland to bring Confederate forces away from Vicksburg. Porter would continue to provide reinforcement to the land troops, and Major General John A. McClernand and his 13th Army Corps would aim for another landing on the east bank of Grand Gulf. This bank was heavily fortified with Confederate defenders at the ready, but Grant was confident in his strategy. Starting off the foray was Porter and his gunboats, which opened fire around 8 a.m., targeting Fort Wade, followed by Fort Coben and their defenses. The Southerners responded with their own artillery fire rather immediately, triggering a battle that would last for hours into the afternoon. The Union Navy eventually overpowered Fort Wade, but then began to struggle with the less susceptible Fort Coben. Even with the initial success against the first fort, subsequently, Porter and Grant eventually decided to pull back as they saw the second line of defense as impenetrable. The Battle of the Grand Gulf had ended, and Grant had once more hit a brick wall. Vicksburg was feeling more and more untouchable, but the general refused to quit. While Grant had his sights locked on Vicksburg, Union General Joseph Hooker was tasked with something about the thorn in the north side. That thorn was General Lee. Hooker also had ambitions of seizing the Confederate capital city, but that couldn't be done without first getting the slick Virginian out of his way. Thus, Hooker and his army of 115,000 prepared for an attack on Lee's dwindled force of only 60,000. The Union commander split his troops into three, sending 2/3 over to Fredericksburg to feign an assault there, while Hooker took the rest of his men to the real target. Lee, knowing what was coming, decided to take a strategic gamble, considering his numerical inferiority. He first divided out 10,000 of his 60,000 men, which would be commanded by General Jubal Early. These troops would remain in Fredericksburg to defend the city. Meanwhile, Lee would take the leftover 50,000 soldiers to face off with Hooker's army of the Potomac. In a forest just west of Chancellorsville, battle erupted. For some reason, despite the clear advantage in numbers and his prior enthusiasm, Hooker suddenly ordered his men to fall back in defensive positions, giving Lee a new edge. In yet another bold move, the Confederate general then split his troops yet again, this time sending his trusty colleague Stonewall Jackson with one portion around the Union's left flank. Stonewall marched his men straight into battle with the Union 11 Corps. Lee, on the other hand, would soon catch wind of an approaching Union force to the east, prompting him to again divide his men so he could face off with his attackers near Salem Church. The battle overall would result in an unexpected and rather spectacular Confederate victory. But there would be one casualty that the South would soon suffer heavily from in particular: the death of Stonewall Jackson. While returning to camp in the dark of night alongside some of his men, the 18th North Carolina Infantry Regiment opened fire without waiting for the group to identify themselves, as they believed them to be Union soldiers. Stonewall was shot 3 times in the process, twice in the left arm and once in the right hand. Over the next few days, he would have his left arm amputated and shortly died of pneumonia complications. The response from General Lee would indicate what a symbolic blow this was for the South. "I have lost my right arm. I'm bleeding at the heart." After the rebel victory, though at a steep cost, the Confederates looked for another win diplomatically. Responding to the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis solidified his earlier statements and more through the Retaliatory Act, which went so far as enabling the execution of Northern black soldiers and their white officers. This hefty political move was followed by another series of armed clashes, of course. The Battle of Raymond would see a Union triumph in Mississippi, but the Battle of Jackson was a bit more indecisive. Meanwhile, Grant had been busy finally chipping away at the path to his ultimate target. "The road to Vicksburg is open," Grant told William T. Sherman in a request for reinforcements. The Confederate higher-ups were currently caught in disputes over their next move, opening up the door for the Union to take full advantage. This would result in the highly significant Battle of Champion Hill, and the Hill of Death, as deemed by Alvin P. Hovey after the fact. The result was a monumental Union victory and a huge step forward for Grant and his Vicksburg campaign. Another triumph for the campaign at the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge would follow, putting increasing pressure on Vicksburg as the Yankees were now set up to besiege the city. 15 miles of trenches were in the works as the siege of Vicksburg began. Grant was confident that this time, the city would be his. The siege began on May 18th, trapping the 29,000-strong Confederate force under General John C. Pemberton and the civilians of Vicksburg in the city. With no supplies and under constant brain-rattling bombardment, Pemberton and all those remaining in the city after 47 days surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863. Grant's dreams had come true. He had taken Vicksburg, and thus the Mississippi. But a lot had happened elsewhere in his absence. The Battle of Brandy Station in Virginia played out in early June, and would set the record as the largest cavalry clash in the entire war. The tussle ended with the Union troops being stymied, and another battle only days later, the Battle of Second Winchester, cleared the Yankees from the Shenandoah Valley. It seems that Grant's luck was better than his comrades, although the Union as a whole found a victory on June 20th when West Virginia officially joined it as a new state. This gave the Northerners something to celebrate, but just days later and hours before Grant would seize Vicksburg, one of the most tragic events of the war and America's history was to take place: the Battle of Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee was the man responsible. Hoping to move the conflict out of war-exhausted Virginia, Lee looked to take the fighting straight to the north, starting in Pennsylvania. With a 75,000-strong army, Lee marched into the Union state, tailed by Union General George Gordon Meade and his 95,000 men. The opposing forces march on until they reach the town of Gettysburg, where Lee stops and begins preparation for the brutal attack that is to come. Meanwhile, Confederate Major General Henry Heth was on his way toward Lee when his force stumbles upon that of Union Brigadier General John Buford. The latter fires on the former, and the battle, unexpectedly, begins. The Confederates respond well to Union fire and start pushing the Northerners back along Chambersburg Pike. Though stalled, the Southerners are not being stopped. Major General John F. Reynolds' Union 1 and 11 Corps soon arrive to support Buford, but it still wouldn't be enough. Reynolds is fatally shot in the neck just as the battle is picking up, and more Confederate reinforcements are joining the fight. General Robert Rhodes and General Jubal Early clash with the Union troops nearby, and together, the rebels begin to box the Yankees in at Gettysburg. As the Union line collapses, many soldiers are able to flee along a nearby railroad, but others are now stuck in the town. The remaining defenders decide to regroup on Cemetery Hill to the south. Holding out in a fishhook formation, the Union men are still surrounded by Southerners, though the battle is not yet lost. Union General Dan Sickles acts next, taking his 3 corps up to Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard, where they run into Confederate forces under the command of General James Longstreet. Sickles' plan backfires abruptly, requiring General Meade to send the entirety of his 5 corps troops to support him. With Longstreet now focusing his attack on the Union left, General Lee sends Hill to take the center, and General Richard Ewell to go for the right. Longstreet's men hit Sickles around Devil's Den and Little Round Top, but to shockingly no avail, as the Union scrambles to bring in more reinforcements. Over at the Peach Orchard, to the contrary, Sickles' men fare quite worse. Casualties are already tallying up in unimaginable numbers as Day 2 of the battle rages on. The Yankees quickly fill the gap left behind by the reinforcements sent to aid Sickles and manage to knock the rebels back at the center. To the right, Generals Ewell and Early aim to rout the Northerners on and around Cemetery Hill as darkness rolls in. The Union holds off at first, but the Confederates soon overwhelm the defenders. Northern reinforcements would shortly renew the fighting on the hill, however. But meanwhile, another Confederate, General Edward Johnson, launches an attack on the Union extreme right at Culp's Hill. With many of these troops having been sent to assist elsewhere, Union General George Greene is left with only 1,300 men to fight off the 4,500 Confederates. Numerical superiority aids the Southerners, but Greene's men hang in there. As Day 2 winds to a close, Gettysburg has already become the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Day 3 will be no better for most. As morning comes, General Lee sends reinforcements to his men at Culp's Hill, but so does General Meade. The tables have now turned, and it's the rebels who lack proper numbers. Nevertheless, the Confederates engage, and a 7-hour foray commences. At first, the Confederates seem to be better off, but by noon, the tide has turned in the Union's favor. Lee, instead of calling more troops to the aid of the right, orders a full-scale attack on the Union left, something Meade had stunningly predicted, making him the first to actually outsmart Robert E. Lee. The center assault would turn into the largest artillery barrage to ever occur in the Western Hemisphere. A spectacular show, but to no success for the Confederates. As the Southerners are forced to march through a mile of open, unprotected ground leading across Emmitsburg Road, the Northerners open heavy fire, ripping apart the rebel attack as Lee pushes for the assault to continue. The Confederates attempt a last-ditch effort to collapse the Union rear with an attack led by General Jeb Stuart, but this fails too. The entire Southern offensive is collapsing on every side. And it soon becomes clear that the Yankees have won the Battle of Gettysburg. Eventually accepting that fact, Lee withdraws toward the Potomac and back into Virginia. It is said that Lee told his men as early as in their retreat that the entire situation was his fault, and he believed this so deeply that he offered his resignation to President Jefferson Davis after the fact, and his guilt was not without reason. His attempts to take the war to the north had caused casualties so high that the wounded alone outnumbered citizens of the town 12-1. More than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the 3 days. Homes and churches had to be transformed into hospitals for the wounded, and bullet holes riddle the town. Part of the battlefield would shortly be turned into a national cemetery for fallen Union soldiers. Slain Confederates were not so lucky. After the catastrophe that was Gettysburg, the Union victory was in many ways overshadowed by the tragedy itself, and the still ongoing war. Not only that, but the excitement for many of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry becoming the first African-American volunteer regiment to see combat in the war was marred by the draft riots that followed. Angry New Yorkers who felt that the conscription system favored the rich began to attack the draft office and black churches, and the anger swiftly spread. The South was faring little better, however, as the war was radically draining its economy and raising the question of how much longer they could even continue to fight. Skirmishes and small-scale clashes carried on through July. At the end of the month, President Lincoln issued General Order 252, declaring that for every black U.S. prisoner of war executed by the South, one Confederate prisoner of war would be killed in return. Tensions were on the rise, and the rebels didn't react well. Lawrence, Kansas was set to face the South's wrath. As the day began on August 21, 1863, rebel guerrillas led by William Clark Quantrill led a raid on the town that resulted in a massacre. Much of Lawrence was burnt to the ground, and at least 160 men and boys were murdered. This wasn't even war. It was a mass-scale homicide, and it represented the extreme anger and desperation felt by many from the South as the war carried on and the Confederacy struggled to keep up. As such, the Union soon captured Chattanooga, Tennessee. Elsewhere at the Battle of Chickamauga, the Confederates found some hope with a victory, and General Braxton Bragg followed it up by launching a siege on Union-occupied Chattanooga. Lee and Meade, meanwhile, clashed in Virginia at the Bristow Station campaign. Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, and Lee was aiming to hold out the Confederate war efforts just long enough to manipulate low Northern morale into electing a Southern sympathizer in Lincoln's upcoming re-election. Sadly for the rebels, however, the siege of Chattanooga eventually failed, and Bragg was forced into Georgia, while another Confederate siege on Knoxville also fell short. The South had started the war strong, but it seems that all the North's technical advantages were finally paying off. Both sides wanted the war to end, but neither was ready to give in. Lee's ultimate plan could still work, but Lincoln had another offer to make any Confederate willing. Swear an oath to the United States, and your rebel acts will be forgiven.